as well. All right, so we are here together on this fabulous Sunday, July, what is it, July 19th? 18th? It's one of those days.
19th.
Oh my goodness. It's almost time to get back to school. Love it. And we were talking about ecological niches. Ecological niches. And niches were just featured on, I want to say, whatever America's time zone is for the IB. I think that's time zone, let's see, 3. On paper 2, there was a question, pretty extensive question about ecological niches. And so is it likely that there'll be another question next year? Maybe, I don't know. It's hard to say. Sometimes, it may not necessarily show up in that particular time zone on paper 2, but it may show up in the other time zones. But I was surprised. I was surprised by how many kids got this question wrong when I was grading exams. And so I'm going to make sure, at the very least today, that you walk out of here understanding the difference between fundamental niches and realized niches. So that's kind of our number one goal today, is that everybody understands the difference between fundamental and realized niches, and how they're different than habitats. Have you ever in your entire life talked about niches?
I think we did in business.
Oh, in business. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's a sociological term. So, humans definitely occupy niches. And a lot of the same principles apply culturally that we see in nature as well. So I think it'll make sense when we chat a little bit about it. I'm going to give you some key terms that you definitely would want to include in any answer if you're asked about the difference between fundamental and realized niches. We'll then also get into kind of a review. I mean, we talked about obligate and facultative anaerobes and aerobes way back at the beginning of your junior year. But we'll just make sure everybody's comfortable with the difference between obligate, facultative, obligate anaerobes, obligate aerobes, and facultative anaerobes. And we're not too, there's a couple of other terms here. Aerotolerant anaerobes and micro aerophiles, and we'll just talk about them, but you're not responsible for knowing these two. And then from there, we're going to talk a bit about photosynthesis, and so that'll be a bit of review from what we ended the year with, and then we'll talk a little bit about holozoic nutrition, which is the IB's new favorite word. So this was not featured in the last curriculum cycle, but man, are they excited about the word holozoic. They just seem to drop it wherever they can. And so if you don't know what that is, it's not the end of the world. It's just a fancy way of talking about organisms that eat and internally digest their food. We'll talk about archaea, our friends, the archaea. And then we'll talk a little bit about the difference between saprotrophs and detritivores. And then there's this really weird new assessment statement all about teeth. And so we'll talk a little bit about teeth as well. So you can see over here on the right side, I've got these beautiful notes. They're not that beautiful. But then, and you can fill these out as we're chatting. And then there is a key right below the notes as well that can help you in your quest to better understand B4.2. All right. Any big questions, any concerns before we get this party started?
Wait, so are you sharing your screen?
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Oh, that's awkward. This entire time. What are you seeing? Are you just seeing?
Just you.
Oh, just this? Oh, that's awkward, bro.
Is there notes for this or?
Yeah. Jeez Louise.
Wait, I can't find the notes.
You see.
Oh man. I can't do anything right. Okay. Now can you see me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Well,
and you said there's no notes. Let me just check Classroom here. Let me make sure our notes are up there. Okay. My fault. Bear with me for 30 seconds. B4.2 ecological niches. Ecological niches. And I'll put that under today's materials. And we're going block A and block H. And I'm posting. It's all happening, folks. It's all happening. All right, now if you check Google Classroom, hopefully you should be able to see that good stuff. All right. How we doing now? We good? Yeah. Okay, so you got everything you need and I don't sound like a crazy person. Maybe a little bit. All right. Man, the text on this is so small. Let me see if I can zoom in a bit. Okay. I'll just try my best. You probably can see this if you have it opened at home. But here are all of the assessment statements. So there's 13. And I believe these are all SL. So there's no HL assessment statements. I don't think there are many HL assessment statements in any of the ecology stuff, which is another reason why we tend to do it in the summer, because it is pretty straightforward. But let's get into it then. Let's talk about what a niche is and really get this party started. Like Pink says, are you familiar with platinum recording artist Pink?
Maybe.
Yeah, I think she's got a song about getting the party started, and that's what we're going to do. All right. So do you remember what we talked about last week? It was very exciting.
We talked about that like graph, that method of seeing, I think, like biodiversity and how much certain plants or species like pop up.
Yeah. So it was all about adaptations to environments. You're right, and we looked at all sorts of climatograms, which are ways that we represent ecosystems and biomes, looking at both their temperature and their precipitation. And we looked at how those climatograms differ if you're talking about like a tropical rainforest or the desert or the tundra or whatever. Absolutely. And we got into some of these factors that affect the distribution of flora and fauna, which is a fancy way of saying plants and animals. And the big ones are obviously, again, temperature and precipitation. But then light is another one, especially for plants. And we know that, plants make up that bottom of that food pyramid. And so indirectly, light also impacts animals. Do you remember the term for how direct or indirect light is quantified or measured?
No.
That's okay. It's a term very similarly sounding. It's a homophone to the way we refer to how warm a house is able to keep itself, or maybe how much down a winter jacket has. So it sounds like insulation, but it's insulation with an O, insolation. And so the equator, which is the kind of the belt that runs around the Earth, that has the most insolation. So that's receiving the most direct sunlight. Whereas if you go up to the North or South Pole, that has the least amount of direct sunlight. And so, when you get up to Denmark and further north, that in the winter, for example, there's very short days. And it gets really extreme once you get to the Arctic Circle, where a day could last three hours. Because there isn't a lot of insolation. Some other factors that affect distribution would be soil pH, salinity. Salinity refers to what?
Like the salt concentration within the soil.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And then we've got food supply, territory, mineral nutrient availability. And so the biggest confusion I see with this idea of niches is kids have a tendency to get it confused with habitats. A habitat. So maybe an analogy that we can use is that our classroom, the Bell Lab, is a habitat, right? However, in that habitat, humans can definitely fulfill different roles, right? And so, for example, in that habitat that is the Bell Lab, I'm the teacher. That's my niche, right? You guys are both students. Ilya is Ilya. Josh is Josh. You guys are all kind of occupying different niches within kind of the realm of being students. And then we have, Dr. Janice steps in from time to time. She occupies the role of a lab technician. So the habitat is the physical location. It's the place, within that ecosystem, a smaller focused area. But then the niche is definitely the role that a living thing occupies within that defined space. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Very cool. And so, when we talk about roles in nature, we're talking about, what that organism's eating, what is eating that particular organism, where that organism is accessing drinking water, where that organism might make its den or its burrow or its nest, all the things that organism needs to kind of be healthy and happy and survive is the niche. And so when an organism kind of comes into the world, it has a lot of possibilities. It has what we call fundamental niches. So it has many different places it potentially could live within an ecosystem and has many different roles that it could potentially carry out. However, it's typically not alone. So whether it's a bird or it's a plant or it's a squirrel or whatever, it's probably going to have other species in its vicinity, in its area, that are also trying to survive. And that's going to create competition. And we know that with competition, typically those two species, even though one species might be able to outcompete the other, it comes at a cost to both of those organisms. Because even if you're like a strong, bigger species, let's take like red squirrels and gray squirrels, for example. Gray squirrels are really successful and at outcompeting red squirrels. They're bigger, they're meaner, they're fatter. And so if you have red squirrels and gray squirrels in the same area, gray squirrels will just outcompete red squirrels, right? However, the gray squirrels are focused on the red squirrels, and that's costing them their time. They're not necessarily having as much time to go out and find food. They're not necessarily having as much time to find nests or to find mates because they're worried about these red squirrels. And so we always describe competition as a minus relationship between two organisms because it's costing both of them negatively. It's obviously going to cost one of them more than the other. And the organism that gets outcompeted probably will be forced into a different niche, or in worst cases, it might actually face extinction. And we see that a lot with invasive species. All right. This is a nice little slide. I'll let you read that for a second. So this is kind of a cool way of thinking about niches as well. They're shaped in terms of abiotic factors. That's kind of the first line. So what's making this particular habitat comfortable for this particular organism? That's kind of what the first line refers to. And then the second line is, okay, so what is this organism doing for that particular ecosystem or habitat? And then the third is, what kind of relationships are emerging between this species and other living things in the area? Is it creating problems? Is it helping to balance the environment? What exactly is it doing? This just gets back to this idea that like competition arises anytime we're establishing new habitat because there is a large number of living things that all want to survive and thrive. And so we refer to that large pool of organisms as a species pool. And then after their establishment, we're going to see kind of species sorting. So we're going to see different species finding different realized niches depending on the levels of competition that they're experiencing. And then ultimately, what's going to happen when all of these organisms kind of fall into equilibrium is we're going to see the establishment of what's known as a fundamental niche. A fundamental niche. So early on, when an organism may be introduced to an environment, we consider their niches to be realized. Or I switched that around. Sorry. We're going to see the establishment of a realized niche. So early on, the niche is fundamental, but as competition emerges, they fall into a very specific role, and that becomes their realized niche. It's kind of like when you're little. I've used this analogy a lot. You can do anything. You think I'm going to be an astronaut, football player who also is a lawyer, but you realize as you get older that that may not necessarily be super realistic. And so you tend to narrow down your idea of what you want to be, and that becomes then your realized niche. And so that's what we see in nature all the time. And this realized niche can change with the introduction of new species or predation or competition or whatever. All right. And we see this like very much so with the introduction of invasive species. All right. These slides are really, really detailed. There's 100 of them, so I may not spend a ton of time on every single slide. But let's look here at our notes and see if there's anything we missed. So, Maya and Gayan, do you feel like you know what an ecological niche is and why it's important in ecology? Did we tackle that?
Yeah.
Awesome. And then do we understand how abiotic factors initially are going to kind of help to determine what niches an organism potentially could occupy?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. And then we've got a whole bunch of fill in the blanks. A blank consists of all the biotic and abiotic factors in an area and the way they interact. What is that?
Ecosystem.
Nailed it. Nailed it. A minority of ecosystems have primary producers that make food using what type of energy? I'm not sure if we talked about this one. What do plants use primarily to make that energy?
Light.
Sun.
Light, yeah. Light. Solar, yeah, light energy. Nailed it. C, a species blank includes all the way it interacts with biotic and abiotic factors in its ecosystem. Starts with an N, ends with an ish.
Niche.
Niche, yeah. And I would say you could even be more specific. You could say that's a fundamental niche, right? Because that's before it's really been introduced to competition. Features of a species habitat depend mainly on what type of factors. Like what type of factor is temperature considered? It's not living, so it must be
Abiotic.
nailed it. Two species cannot occupy the same niche in the same habitat. So that's where this idea, that's okay. That's this idea of where competitive exclusion comes in. An ecosystem needs a constant input of blank to supply the needs of its organ. Energy, yeah. And usually, again, that's light energy. Unlike energy, what is recycled through the ecosystem?
Like the organisms themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And generally we refer to that as matter. So matter gets to be recycled, whereas energy comes in and leaves. And then I believe in here there's a little example of the dung beetle. Let's see if I can find that in here. Oh, this is kind of cool though. I should just show you this really quickly. There's this idea called of ecological equivalence, and it's a product of something called convergent evolution. Convergent evolution. And so if the abiotic factors of a particular area are very similar to another area, and it can be completely on the other side of the globe, you can get organisms that evolve totally independent of one another, but look and act very similarly. It's really cool. So we've seen this before in a lot of analogous structures where we see organisms that don't have any kind of evolutionary relationship developing some of the same abilities and physical features just due to the pressures presented by their environment. And so at the most basic level, you can think about wings. The wings of a bat are very different than the wings of a bird. And both the wings of a bird and the wings of a bat are very different than the wings of an insect. And so that's a product of convergent evolution. And these are, again, analogous structures because they've been crafted by the pressures of the environment. And so, a bird and a bat are totally different organisms, but they both have the ability to fly. And we see that with these two poisonous frogs. They're very, very similar. You find one in Madagascar, in the jungles of Madagascar, but a lot of the jungles of South America are similar to those jungles of Madagascar. And so we see what's known again as an ecological equivalent. It's kind of cool. It's like a doppelganger. And we were looking for dung beetles, right? Let's find this. Maybe there are no dung beetles. It's a lie. That's okay. And so, before we move on, basically, if you're ever presented with a question about niches, you need to address a couple of things. Number one, what's a fundamental niche? Number two, what's a realized niche? Number three, how does predation and competition craft realized niches? And then the fourth one is really making sure that you're clear that a habitat and a niche are two different things. A habitat's the location, the niche is the role that an organism plays within that location. So if you guys feel comfortable with that, we'll move on. And I will take your silence as a yes. All right, next one. Autotrophs versus heterotrophs. We've talked about this. What's the difference? I know you guys know it.
Like whether you eat your own food or like I forgot the other one.
Oh, yeah, no, you're on the right track. So like it'd be so cool, right? If we could go out and stand in the sunlight and generate sugar.
Whether you produce your own energy or you like find another way to like eat it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so like we always think about photoautotrophs, right? But then remember, we'll talk about this later, there are chemoautotrophs. So there's organisms that can use chemicals as an electron acceptor in the electron transport chain of cell respiration. And they can and then they can convert that into sugar, which is pretty cool. So there's like methanogens that live in cows' stomachs. There's haliophytes. There's all sorts of different organisms that use things other than oxygen in order to generate energy. All right. And then within that kind of umbrella of heterotrophy, we're going to talk about the difference between being a saprotroph, being parasitic, and being holozoic. And so again, this word holozoic is very hot right now with the IB crowd. And so it definitely will come up on exams. And so I want to make sure that you understand what holozoic nutrition is. Here's a nice overview of the differences between autotrophs and heterotrophs. I won't read this slide to you, but it is a nice, nice summary. And again, I think this has come up in other units as well, like when we talked about cell respiration and photosynthesis. Now, I don't know if you remember this, and if you don't, that's not a judgment. But early on, in the first few weeks, I should say, of the IB program, we talked about the difference between facultative anaerobes, obligate anaerobes, and obligate aerobes. And so we'll just review that briefly, because that really plays into the underlying ideas of heterotrophs and autotrophs. Because again, heterotrophs and autotrophs ultimately are looking for oxygen to serve as an electron transport acceptor, or an electron acceptor in cell respiration. And so that's kind of at the core of all of this conversation about how we get energy. Really, it all comes down to the mitochondria and how the mitochondria are functioning. And so this is the classic kind of image when we think about obligate aerobes, facultative anaerobes, and obligate anaerobes. But what does this mean basically? So we have bacteria, and they're within this vial, right? And the bacteria are establishing colonies that we can see with our naked eye, and it's dependent on how close they are to oxygen. And so, for example, these obligate aerobes here, so this could be like, I don't know, E. coli, they are all forming colonies very close to the top of this vial because they want to have access to that oxygen, right? They need oxygen in order to convert glucose to ATP. And so anything like you and I that can't live without oxygen is considered to be an obligate aerobe. You're obligated to have oxygen at all times. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got obligate anaerobes. And so a lot of our friends from the archaea domain don't want to be anywhere near oxygen. It's toxic, it's poisonous to them. And so if we look at the same setup with obligate anaerobes, you're going to find all of them chilling down here at the bottom of the vial as far away from oxygen as possible. And then in the middle, we've got stuff like yeast. We use yeast to make bread and alcohol. And facultative anaerobes, they can use oxygen if it's available, but they're flexible enough to get by without it. And so this is kind of the happy medium. There's a couple of other examples that she's thrown in here that you won't be asked about, but they are kind of interesting. So this is aerotolerant anaerobes. So these are bacteria that can grow in the presence of oxygen but don't need it. And then we've got microaerophile, and it's got very precise requirements. So it just needs a little oxygen, and if it has too much oxygen, it won't survive. So this could be like maybe an evolutionary step that we saw as we transition from obligate anaerobes to obligate aerobes. Do you guys remember the equation for photosynthesis? Do you have it tattooed anywhere on you? I thought we were all going to get matching photosynthesis. No, nobody got tattoos this summer. I'm the only one.
Yeah.
Guyan, you promised you were going to get a back tattoo of the equation for photosynthesis. What happened?
I did.
Yeah, all you were talking about all of May.
I know the equation though.
You do? What's the equation?
Without it. It's
without the tattoo.
6 CO2 plus
Yep.
light or plus water, and
Yep.
then light energy makes C6H12O6 plus oxygen. 6
Yep.
oxygen.
Well done. That's great. Yep, you remember that. And you don't necessarily need to know the chemical equation. You can also do the word equation. That's totally fine as well. That's totally acceptable. And then, of course, you remember I don't even know why I'm saying this, but cell respiration is then just the opposite of that, right? Boom. Um, ba, 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 ba. I'm just kind of skipping through a lot of this. This is just the establishment of oxygen in our atmosphere and how all of the oxygen that we totally take for granted is all the product of cyanobacteria. And what's interesting about this is that we currently produce just enough oxygen to make life survivable. And the vast majority of that oxygen is being produced in our world's oceans. It's not the rainforest like a lot of people think. Oh, the rainforest, it's the Earth's lungs. That's true, but the oceans contribute far more oxygen to the atmosphere than the rainforests. And the scary part about that is that if, oceans continue to warm and acidify, that could spell doom in terms of our global oxygen supplies. And so that's another thing to give you nightmares. If you needed more climate related nightmare fuel. We're going to just kind of skip through this. There's that equation that Guyan just mastered. Here it is again. Here we go. Now, there are some elements that plants need that aren't included in this equation, right? And so minerals, for example, which are down here at the bottom, are all going to be absorbed by the plant's root system. And they're very clever in that roots create hypertonic situations. So they create situations where there's a lot of minerals in the roots themselves. And what this does is then creates osmosis. And so you wonder, oh, why do I have to water plants? Well, plants are clever in that they use water to drive minerals up into the plant. So they use energy to create a hypertonic solution in the roots. And then they use passive energy from water to not only get water, because plants need water, but also to drive minerals up so that the plant can grow and thrive and be successful. The crazy thing about plants is they absorb so much water, but they really only use 1% of it for their own needs. And the rest of it gets transpired or released as gas out of its leaves. And that contributes to our weather and our clouds and our rain. So it has lots of benefits for us, but doesn't necessarily benefit the tree or the plants that much. All right. And so now let's not talk as much about plants. Let's talk about animals. And now we finally get to learn about that amazing word, holozoic. But before we get too crazy, let's just look at our notes and make sure that we're comfortable with obligate, facultative, and obligate aerobes, obligate anaerobes, and obligate aerobes. And so this seems pretty straightforward in terms of dependency and tolerance and energy production. And so hopefully we're comfortable with all that. You can, again, ignore this column. And they didn't even include the other column in this one. And then going down, we talked about photosynthesis, and hopefully we're all comfortable with photosynthesis as well. Any questions? I know I'm talking a lot. Anything I can help clarify? You doing okay?
Nope.
Yeah, you guys multitasking? Are you watching Suits or Modern Family as we're chatting today?
No, but there's a World Cup later.
There is. It's very exciting. So I caught my daughter. She likes to watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine when she should be doing other things. Have you ever seen that show?
I've heard about it.
It's quite funny. And I think it's like relatively appropriate. I don't think it's like that risque. But she likes to watch the television series. All right, so let's talk heterotrophs. Boom, boom, boom. So you and I are heterotrophs. Most animals are heterotrophs. All animals are heterotrophs. I can't really think of any animal that's, I guess, like some of the single-celled protists might be both heterotrophs and autotrophs. But mammals are definitely heterotrophs. This idea of holozoic nutrition basically means that organisms that are holozoic they ingest another organism and then they internally break it down and absorb it. Okay. And you might be saying like, why even like have that qualifier? What organism doesn't do it? Well, there are these other things called saprotrophs. Mushrooms, for example, are saprotrophs. And what saprotrophs do is they excrete enzymes externally on food. So like mold, if you leave something in your refrigerator too long, mold might grow. And what that mold is doing is it's excreting enzymes, and then those enzymes are externally breaking down that food. And then the fungi is able to then absorb the product of that chemical reaction and ingest it that way. So we have internal, which is holozoic, and we have external, which is saprotrophic. There's a type of decomposer that is holozoic, like an earthworm, for example, and they're referred to as detritivores. So oftentimes with decomposers, you'll see saprotrophs and detritivores. Detritivores are just a type of holozoic organism that breaks things down internally. Saprotrophs break things down externally. Let's see. And here's an example with an amoeba. And then we do have mixotrophs, and so those are organisms that can do both. So a euglena again comes to mind. It's a little single-celled critter that can undergo photosynthesis when it needs to, but also can engulf and use endocytosis to get its nutrients. I guess Venus flytraps might be considered a mixotroph, but they're pretty rare. Do any of the dorm kids have Venus flytraps? I feel like every once in a while somebody will get a Venus flytrap in the dorms. All right.
No.
No, nobody's got a Venus flytrap. You guys could be trendsetters.
Do you have one?
Do I have one? I do not.
You should get one.
I should. Here's our friend. The euglena, as I mentioned before. So this is a good example of a mixotroph. So again, you can see the green pigment, so it's got chlorophyll, and it can undergo photosynthesis. But then it can also, like an amoeba, it can engulf things and then break it down. So it's called an obligate mixotroph. And here's some other examples. Is it plankton? So if you're a big fan of SpongeBob, plankton is a mixotroph. And it doesn't make mention of Venus flytrap, but I feel like this amongst plants, carnivorous, parasitic, mycoheterotrophic species. All right. And then as promised, let's talk a little bit about saprotrophs. And so most of the fungi kingdom excrete chemicals externally, and then they break down the products of those chemical reactions. And so that's called saprotrophy. And so this is wild. This woman has a TED Talk where she's created a burial suit. So when she dies, right, she wants to be buried in this, and it's seeded with the spores of a bunch of different mushrooms. And so within a year or however long it takes, all these fungi will bloom. I don't know. They'll start to grow, and then they'll start to feed on her body. And so I don't remember how long she said it would take in the TED Talk, but basically it would break down and decompose her body. And her argument was that cemeteries are kind of a huge waste of space. And, if we change our mindset about, death and burial, we could actually really benefit the cycle of agriculture. And so I think she wants to be buried in a garden, and then basically she would provide nutrients for plants and vegetables and stuff. But then people would eat those. So I wonder if that'd be weird for people. I don't know. Bump, 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 bump. And then counter to that is these guys, the detritivores. And so millipedes, centipedes, earthworms, crabs at the bottom of the ocean. organisms that exclusively just eat dead things, but then they break them down internally, those are called detritivores. And so if you've gone fishing and a worm is broken in half and you can look inside the worm, a lot of times you'll see like dirt and debris. That's detritus. And it's basically the worm breaking down that decomposing matter, and then ultimately pooping it out the other side. And so this gets into minutia a little bit, but I tend to think of saprotrophs and detritivores as just decomposers. But here they're making the argument that detritivores are actually a type of saprotroph. I don't think you need to know that. The takeaway, like what you'll be asked on your test in October, is basically what's the difference, and then can you give an example of each? And so again, saprotrophs digest externally, detritivores digest internally. Earthworms are an example of a detritivore. Fungi are an example of a saprotroph. Does that make sense? I don't want to overcomplicate this. Yeah? Okay. I'll take that as a yes. Look at that. Earthworm in action. Got a big old tasty leaf. It's going to turn into dirt. And then we see all of these. You got to remember, archaea are a pretty diverse group of single-celled organisms that live in extreme environments. And in order to live in all these extreme environments, they display all of these different types of feeding. So there's heterotrophs, there's holozoic archaea, there's mixotrophs. Some survive with oxygen, some survive without oxygen. And so they really exhibit the spectrum of feeding behaviors. Just a little bit of review. So the big ones are methanogens. And so if you've ever driven past like a stockyard or a farm, you've smelled cows. It's not pleasant. Oftentimes we blame our siblings for the smell, but it's not even really the cow's fault that they're so stinky. It's actually what's happening in their guts. And so with cows, we see a symbiotic relationship between the cows and archaea, methanogens, that are breaking down some of the cellulose, some of the plant matter that you and I couldn't necessarily break down to turn into sugar. But as a byproduct, they're producing methane. And so methane is kind of dwarfed in comparison to carbon dioxide in terms of being a greenhouse gas. Like there's far more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than methane. But what's problematic about methane is that it takes a lot longer to break down. And then when it breaks down into water vapor and carbon dioxide. So those are both greenhouse gases. So it's problematic in that like it sticks around a lot longer. And then when it does finally break down, it's still problematic because it's still carbon dioxide. And so it's another reason why ultimately the world is going to have to transition to a more plant-based diet. It's just not sustainable for this many humans to be eating meat. It don't work. Have you seen like the infographics about like how many resources go to make a hamburger, like how much water and how much like energy? It's insane. Like it's just not a sustainable practice. So maybe in our lifetime we'll see a dramatic shift. I feel like we already are seeing a dramatic shift, but it definitely is helpful that places like India are primarily vegetarians, because if that was an extra billion people that all ate beef, that would be no bueno. Halophiles are another type of extremophile or archaea, and they live in really salty environments. So the Dead Sea, the Great Salt Lake in Utah. Thermophiles, we talked about Taq polymerase when we were talking about the polymerase chain reaction, and Taq polymerase would be an example of a thermophile. So if you go to any place, Iceland, there's places all over Switzerland, in the United States here, there's Yellowstone, that have a lot of geothermal activity. You're going to see thermophiles. All right. How we doing? We okay? Do you guys need to take a bathroom break?
I'm fine.
You're all good? All right, this is crazy. This is a new assessment statement. And so from a teaching perspective, teachers are always asking the IB, please cut down on content, cut down on content. There's too much, there's too much, there's too much. And so I don't know if the IB doesn't hear that or if, I don't know what the story is, but this is new. They introduced a new assessment statement all about teeth, which is just like, come on, man. It's interesting, but whatever. It's probably not crucial for high school biology students to know. But the basic understanding here, the basic idea behind this assessment statement is that as our diets, as primates evolved, specifically hominids evolved, our diets became more varied, right? We introduced more and more meat to our diet. We started off very vegetarian, but as we developed the ability to hunt in groups and we developed our ability to do something called persistence hunting, we got more successful at acquiring meat. And then eating all that meat really helped with our brain development. So if you wonder, like, man, how have humans come to really just dominate the ecosystems or the world? A lot of that is brain power. And that brain power was generated through the consumption of protein or meat, right? And so with that, we had to develop teeth that could help us ingest meat. So if you go from like just eating plants to starting to eat meat, that's going to be troubling because, like, how do you tear that meat? How do you rip it up? And so that's where we see the development of canines and the development of incisors to help us digest meat. But at the same time, we're also dependent on vegetables and fruits, right? And so we still need some of those grinding teeth to help us with vegetative matter as well. And so you can see throughout our evolution, if you go from chimps all the way up to humans, you can see those changes occurring in our dental structure. And so humans have incredibly varied teeth, whereas you don't see that much variety or as much variety in chimps, right? So let's take a look at teeth. Teeth. So do you guys know the different types of teeth? You got, when I say incisors, what am I referring to?
Teeth inside of your mouth, like more.
Yeah, these guys, right? Like the kind of the teeth at the front that are good for tearing and slicing. And then our canines, we have 4 canines. They're not as pronounced as they used to be, but you can kind of see down here this chimpanzee, how incredibly pronounced their canines are. So they're probably getting some meat in their diets as well. But this also could be for, defense. Chimpanzees are pretty cruel, pretty nasty, and very tribal. And so this could also just be for fighting amongst themselves, right? And so this is a really nice overview. It talks about some of the teeth that we have and how that compares to other animals. So lots of carnivores, lots of cats and dogs, are members of that cat and dog family, have canines, and those are their most pronounced teeth. And we still have our canines. They're not as pronounced as they once were. And then incisors, we know that rodents have ever-growing incisors. And so if you look at beavers, for example, their teeth just grow constantly throughout their life. And that's part of the reason why they're driven to gnaw and cut things down, is to kind of stem the growth of those incisors and keep them at a manageable length. If they weren't out there, gnawing on wood, those incisors would just keep growing and growing and growing, and that would create some serious issues for those beaver. We've got premolars and molars. Those are all kind of for grinding and crushing. And then this is interesting. We've kind of lost teeth as we've evolved. And so we started off as primitive apes. Primitive mammals was something near 66 teeth. Can you imagine having a mouthful of 66 teeth? Jeez Louise. And then we went to 44, and then now we're at 32. And I don't know if that includes wisdom teeth. So it's either 36 with wisdom teeth or 28 without wisdom teeth. Do y'all have your wisdom teeth?
I got 2 removed, but I have all 4.
Okay. Okay. Diane, you got wisdom teeth?
Yeah.
Yeah. I had some premolars removed when I was like 13, 14, and so that left room for my wisdom teeth to grow in. But this last bullet does refer to wisdom teeth, and it said 20% of the human population doesn't have them at all. And so that's starting to become what we call a vestigial structure. So when you think vestigial structure, you might think of like your tailbone, right? It's evidence of a structure that once existed that no longer is used. So your wisdom teeth are also considered vestigial structures. You know that little pink spot in the corner of your eye right here? That's a vestigial structure. We used to have kind of built-in swim goggles that went and closed this way. Like sharks still have them, and crocodiles and alligators. It's called a nictitating membrane. And that little pink spot in the corner of our eye is a vestigial structure. What other your appendix is a vestigial structure. Man, some people think your pinky toe is a vestigial structure, and eventually it'll disappear. But wisdom teeth are also considered vestigial structures. Another kind of interesting thing about humans is that we have those two sets of teeth, right? And so, you get baby teeth when you're a child, but then obviously as your skull grows, all of those teeth are replaced by larger and more durable teeth as you become an adult. You guys don't have any of your baby teeth still, do you? You've lost all your teeth?
Nope.
Yeah. Do your parents keep them in a jar?
No.
No, you should ask your parents. I bet they still have your teeth. I think my wife has my
like
kids'
maybe
teeth.
when I was like young, but I think we've lost them all.
No, I bet your mom has a secret drawer with all of you and your sister's baby teeth somewhere, and one day she's gonna give them back to you, and you're gonna be like, "Oh,
That's kind
thanks."
of creepy, sir.
Well, yeah, but like, I don't know, it's your kid. I don't know.
But they become like extra fragile
Do they?
because
Oh,
of
jeez.
calcium. Like if you don't put it in milk and stuff.
That's why. So they wouldn't make a good necklace. It'd be weird to have a necklace of your kid's teeth, wouldn't it? What if you put it in like what if you made some stylish earrings? No?
I don't know about that.
Fine. All right. Okay. Bump, 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 bump. We're gonna skip forward a little bit more. So I guess the big takeaway for this particular new assessment statement is that like as hominids, which is the type of primate that we are, as we've evolved, we've essentially gained a wider variety of teeth. And we've also become kind of more efficient in that we have less teeth, but we have a nice diversity of teeth that allow us to really maximize an omnivore's diet. We can eat vegetables, we can eat fruits, we can eat jello, we can eat steak, whatever. And neither of you guys are vegetarians, are you?
No.
No.
Yeah. All right. Bump, 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 bump. There's some terminology that we associate with different types of feeding strategies in holozoic organisms. So, like, that herbivores only eat what?
Plants?
Plants. Yeah, herbivores only eat plants. And it's weird because herbivory is actually considered to be a type of predation. So when I think predators, I think of like, killer whales or polar bears or whatever. But eating plants is technically predation. You're preying on grass, which is just a weird thought, to think of rabbits as predators. Really, but technically it is predation. And then within that umbrella of herbivory, we see grazers, browsers, grainivores, frugivores, nectivores, phloem feeders. So you've got lots of different ways that you can eat plant matter. This is far more detail, though, than you need to know about herbivores. I think just knowing that herbivores exclusively eat plants is good enough. And then I mentioned earlier that you and I were omnivores, so we have a tendency to eat both plants and animals. And then obviously there are some organisms that are straight carnivores. You and I can't be straight carnivores. Do you know why?
No.
So we don't naturally produce vitamin C. And so, and you can't get vitamin C from meat. And vitamin C is essential for the production and maintenance of the most abundant protein in our bodies. Do you know what the most abundant protein in the human body is?
Mm-mm.
There's lots of beauty products that claim to promote its health. Collagen. Have you heard about collagen before?
Yeah.
Yeah, so collagen keeps our skin nice and smooth and wrinkle free, right? It keeps our skin elastic. It holds our teeth in our jaws. It keeps our organs in place. And vitamin C is essential to the maintenance of that collagen. And so if you don't eat fruits and vegetables, if you straight up just eat meat, right, you develop something called scurvy. And if you've ever seen like a movie about pirates or whatever, they're always very concerned about scurvy, right? Because they were at sea and they were eating a lot of dried meat. And they figured out pretty quickly that whenever you went on these long voyages at sea, you had to bring lots of citrus fruits, so lots of limes and whatnot. And that was to avoid getting scurvy. And so lately I've been listening to this podcast. And I know it's cliche for people to talk about the podcast they've been listening to, but super interesting. It's about extreme survival stories. And it's hosted by this lady who is famous for doing these long distance dog sledding races. So she's done dog sledding races all over the world. And so she's a bit of a survivalist herself. But the common issue in all of these survival stories that she kind of chronicles is scurvy. So these people are able to find seal, for example. So there'll be like an Arctic expedition that gets stranded on this Arctic island, and they're only able to just find seals, and they'll eat seal meat, which is gross, by the way. Don't ever eat it. It's super gamey and weird and tastes like fish. But they'll all develop scurvy and die because there's nothing but seal. Or there's a famous book called Into the Wild. It's about a fella who goes to Alaska and he decides, I'm going to live in Alaska. And he ends up like living in this bus, and all he's eating is rabbits. And so eventually he develops scurvy because rabbit meat not only doesn't have vitamin C, doesn't have any fat. And so he also loses all of his fat stores as well. And he ends up dying. And then eventually his book and the movie that the book or movie that's based on the book becomes so famous that people want to go out and visit the bus in Alaska where he died. And then those people started to get trapped out in Alaska. And so they actually had to helicopter the bus out and put it in a museum. And I think his name is Christopher McCandless. And I feel like you read it in an AP class, but I don't think you read it in the IB class. It's a good book. So those are herbivores. And then again, you're going to see herbivores exhibiting a ton of molars and premolars, right? Because they don't need to tear and slice. They just need to grind. And so that's always a dead giveaway. If you find a jawbone in the woods or something, if it just has molars, it's probably a herbivore. It's probably like a moose or a deer or something. And then they also have all sorts of other cool adaptations. We know that cows, for example, or ruminants have multiple stomachs. So they'll like chew, then they'll send things to the stomach for breakdown. Then that stuff comes back up and they chew it some more. And then they send it to a second stomach. And then those stomachs have enzymes that we don't have. So they have cellulase, for example, that breaks down cellulose. And so that would be another adaptation of herbivores as well. And this is a nice example of a cow's stomach. And when we get back to school, I'll show you a video. If you go to a state fair or a county fair around the United States, what they'll do is they'll take a cow and they'll put a port on the side of the cow. So they'll put a little window, and it doesn't hurt the cow, but it allows them to actually reach into the cow, and it's alive, and pull out the plant matter in its stomachs, and you can measure how digested it is, and you can measure like the bacterial counts and stuff. And then here's what's even wilder, right? They'll take the bacteria from a healthy cow out of this port, out of this little hole, and then they'll inject it into a sick cow that's lost its probiotics, that's lost its healthy bacteria, to help get that cow kind of back on its feet. Isn't that crazy? And that's called a fecal transplant. And they do it in humans too, which is not from cows, but from other humans. Or maybe not from other humans, but maybe just the bacteria strain. And this is so different than what you'd see in a non-ruminant. So like you and I just have one stomach, right? We don't have these 4-chambered stomachs. All right. Jump ahead a little bit more. Now, the only thing I'll say here is that, as we're talking about herbivores, is that there's another term that I've seen pop up more and more and more in recent exams, and that's I think it's called allopathy, Alleopathy, and that's how plants defend themselves from herbivores. So plants can secrete chemicals, and this can detract from the feeding of herbivores, but then it also can inhibit the growth of other plants near it. And so for whatever reason, I've seen this popping up more and more and more in exams, this notion of a plant's chemical defense mechanisms, which again, I think is called allopathy, but I'll look it up as well. All right, we're almost to the end. What time we got? 11:05. Oh, we're 5 minutes over. So if you're not a herbivore, if you're an omnivore or a carnivore, you're likely going to exhibit predation. And predation is a plus-minus relationship. So it's a benefit to one organism, and it's obviously super negative for whatever's getting eaten. There's all sorts of different ways that predators and prey interact. And it's a symbiotic relationship, right? And so, for example, north of where I am is a famous island called Isle Royal, and it's famous for its moose and wolf studies. And so what they've been doing for over a century is tracking the population of the wolves and the moose on the island. And ideally you want about 200 wolves and about 1,200 moose. But anytime the moose numbers or the wolf numbers get too high or too low, it has a dramatic negative impact on the other organisms. And so right now, the wolf numbers are really, really low, and so the moose numbers are exploding. But this is causing all sorts of problems, like disease and lots of competition within the moose. And so they're talking about introducing more wolves to cut down the moose population. And predator and prey obviously are going to invest energy in developing different strategies to deal with one another. So there are some examples here of some adaptations that predators exhibit, and then some adaptations that prey exhibit as well. And we'll get more into this when we talk about natural selection and evolution. Let's see. So I'm kind of skipping over this bit about tropisms. You may not think about it, but plants move and they respond to the different things in their environment. And they have different chemicals or phytochromes that help them do this, or phytohormones, excuse me. And so the biggest one that you probably have seen before is phototropisms. And that's just how plants grow towards light. And so there's all sorts of videos online where sunflowers are shifting their position based on the presence of sunlight. And you can see that just with house plants all around you, how they're always growing towards the light. There's also thigmotropisms, and so that's a response to touch. And so there's a famous plant called the touch-me-not, and when you touch it, all of its leaves move and change, and that's a pretty cool mechanism as well. And then there's gravitropisms, I don't know if they're in here, but gravitropisms are how seeds know to grow up. And they can actually sense gravity, and hormones accumulate on the bottom side that force the plant up out of the soil. All right. Well, I took you a little bit over time, but just in summary, if you're asked what the big ideas are, it's what's a niche. Okay. What's a niche? That's new information. We've never talked about that before. What's the difference between a realized niche, a fundamental niche? How is a niche different than a habitat? The second thing we talked about was review. That's the difference between an obligate aerobe, an obligate anaerobe, and a facultative aerobe. And we've talked about that in the past. The third thing we talked about was, what is a saprotroph? What is a detritivore? What is a holozoic animal? Like how are those feeding strategies different? And then we talked a little bit about dentition, and so how do teeth help mammals, particular hominids, to introduce a variety of different things in their diet. And then last but not least, we kind of got into a little bit with the adaptations that animals exhibit with predators and prey, and also with plants, but this will come up in evolution as well. So there's a lot of redundancy in terms of some of these assessment statements where they come up in different topics. But that is B4.2 in a nutshell. How we doing? Questions, concerns? Nope. Cool. And then I do have a whole series of videos where it goes through them in about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and then it stops you at all the key points to ask you questions. And I'll also highlight in the study guide specifically what you need to know for the test, just to make it more clear. Are there any other resources that I can provide for you that will help make life easier, or?
No. Is there like a study guide for all of these topics? Since I think when we get back, we're gonna have a test on like everything.
Yeah. So if you look here, right?
Or is it just the note guide with the meeting links and?
Yeah. And so here, what I'm trying to do here is really just narrow it down, right? And just highlight specifically what you need to know. And so there's a lot of stuff, especially in this one. Like there's so much in here that I wouldn't necessarily pay too much mind to. And so as soon as we're done here, I'll go through and highlight in this table specifically what to focus in on as well. So, and this will be your best bet. And so this is a pretty extensive 15-page document, but when we're done, we'll be able to kind of break this down into 2 or 3 pages of information, just to make it more manageable and easy for you. All right, well, have an enjoyable day. Hope you guys watch the World Cup game, but it'll probably be on at like 4 a.m. where you are, right? Or later than it will be here.
It's at 9, but probably late for then.
Oh no.
I think it's at like 10.
Oh, okay. All right.
Mhm.
Well, have a wonderful day, and maybe we'll see you next Sunday.
Yep. Thank
Should
you.
we recruit? I'll try to recruit one more person. I'll try to get somebody from the other class to join. All right. All right. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
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 I want to end the recording. How do I do that today? I'd like to end the recording. I wrote a song about it. It's called Stop Sharing. And now it's done. Bum, bum, bum. Stop recording. Stop recording.